Welcome back to Avoidant Decoded. If you're new here, this is your space to finally make sense of confusing attachment patterns, avoidant behavior, and the emotions people hide behind distance. Before we dive in, if you want to go deeper into this journey, consider joining the Avoidant Decoded membership for exclusive insights and support on your healing path. Now, let's get into today's topic. Few people stir up as much emotional confusion as someone with an avoidant attachment style. One minute they seem genuinely into you, the next they've gone cold. They pull back right when things start feeling close. They send confusing signals when you're trying to build something real, and you're often left wondering if you're the only one putting in emotional effort. But there's a piece of this puzzle most people miss entirely. Just because an avoidant seems checked out doesn't mean they actually are. More often than not, the feelings are very much present. They're just buried under thick layers of self-protection. Some avoidants become deeply preoccupied with a person they care about, yet they'll never own up to it. They won't tell you. They won't tell their friends. Sometimes they won't even let themselves fully admit it to themselves. It's a quiet, invisible tug-of-war. Part of them craves closeness. Another part dreads everything closeness demands of them. So they end up stuck, caught between wanting you and protecting themselves from you. If you've ever left a situation convinced the other person didn't care at all, it might be worth looking closer. Here are 5 subtle but telling signs that an avoidant might be far more invested than they're letting on. First, they notice more than they let on. One of the biggest giveaways shows up in the small details they hang on to. Avoidants can be surprisingly perceptive when it comes to people they're attached to. They pick up on shifts in your mood, they clock your habits, and they remember conversations, posts, and tiny moments most people would forget entirely. What throws people off is that they almost never show how closely they're actually watching. In the moment, they might seem checked out or unbothered, barely reacting when you share something important to you. Then, weeks down the line, they'll casually bring up something you mentioned in passing, some oddly specific detail that makes it obvious they were paying way more attention than they ever let on. It's almost like they're studying you from a distance, instead of engaging directly. Rather than opening up about how they feel, they collect information silently. They watch. They take note without saying anything. You might catch them viewing your social media the second you post, even though they rarely reach out on their own. You might see them act totally unaffected in front of others, but then get visibly uneasy the moment someone else starts getting your attention. These little reactions often say more than any conversation could. What looks like emotional detachment is sometimes just them trying to manage feelings that feel like too much to handle. The interest hasn't gone anywhere. Expressing it is what they struggle with. Second, your pulling back sets off a reaction they didn't expect. This sign tends to surface the moment you stop chasing them. As long as they're the one setting the distance, avoidants usually feel pretty safe. They can tell themselves things are under control. But once you start mirroring their energy and stepping back yourself, something shifts. The dynamic they were used to no longer feels predictable, because now the space isn't something they chose. That shift can stir up a lot beneath the surface. They rarely respond by opening up honestly. Instead, you'll see it show up sideways. Maybe they get unusually snippy, irritated by little things that never bothered them before, colder than usual, or oddly passive-aggressive. From the outside, it can look like they've simply lost interest, but often it's the opposite. Losing your attention forces them to face feelings they'd been avoiding. Suddenly, the idea of actually losing you feels real, and that can wake up fears they've been burying for a long time. Sometimes their behavior flips almost overnight. They start texting more, asking questions about your life without being direct about it, finding excuses to pop back up after going quiet, even showing up somewhere they know you'll be. Saying, "I don't want to lose you," out loud feels too exposed. So instead, they try to rebuild the connection through actions instead of words. It's not always obvious on the surface, but what they do often says what their ego won't let them say out loud. Third, they hold on to things you've long forgotten. One of the more surprising signs is just how much emotional information avoidants tend to store away. Even though they often seem disengaged during emotional moments, they can carry meaningful memories for years. They remember dates, stories, and offhand comments neither of you thought twice about at the time. Then, out of nowhere, months later, they'll bring up some tiny detail you barely remember sharing yourself. The reason is simple. When someone genuinely matters to them, their brain quietly files that away, whether they ever admit it or not. Those memories become emotional touch points, even if they never talk about their feelings directly. They hold on to fragments of the connection without saying a word about it. And when those memories keep resurfacing long after the moment has passed, it usually points to a level of emotional investment that runs far deeper than they're willing to show. For an avoidant, remembering isn't just remembering. It's often a hidden way of staying tied to someone while acting completely unaffected. That contradiction is really the core of why avoidants are so hard to read. They tend to feel a lot more than they show. They just don't know how to safely let it out. As mentioned, avoidants often work hard to convince everyone, including themselves, that a connection means nothing. They act indifferent and unbothered, but their memory usually tells a very different story. One of the clearest signs of hidden attachment is exactly how much they remember. The name of a childhood pet, your go-to coffee order, a random dream you mentioned once, some minor childhood story that seemed like nothing at the time. Those aren't the kinds of things people retain when they genuinely don't care. When someone feels no real attachment, that kind of information just fades. It doesn't take up mental real estate. But when an avoidant is quietly attached and fighting those feelings, their mind tends to hang on to every meaningful detail, almost like they're secretly archiving pieces of you. They can go long stretches without reaching out and still somehow recall things you don't even remember telling them. Then, out of nowhere, one of those details slips out mid-conversation, leaving you stunned that they even remembered. The truth is, they were paying attention the whole time, not because they wanted to admit their feelings, but because the attachment ran deeper than they were ready to acknowledge. In a lot of ways, remembering becomes their substitute for saying it out loud. Instead of telling you, "You matter to me," they show it through the things they've quietly kept track of. That's the internal tug-of-war that defines so much avoidant behavior. One part of them wants space. Another part stays deeply attached, and those two forces are constantly at odds. Fourth, they linger nearby without ever fully closing the gap. Another confusing pattern is the way avoidants keep a subtle presence in your life without committing to real connection. They rarely move straight toward you. Instead, they orbit the edges. You might notice them turning up in places you frequent, engaging with posts from people in your circle, getting more active online whenever you are, or conveniently showing up at events they know you'll attend. None of it is direct enough to require any real vulnerability, but it keeps the connection alive in some form. This kind of behavior usually reflects a desire to stay close emotionally while dodging the risk that comes with real exposure. They want the reassurance of your presence, but they also want protection from rejection or disappointment, so they hover close enough to feel connected, far enough to deny it if asked. It's a careful balancing act, near enough to observe, but distant enough to maintain deniability. If you call it out, they'll usually brush it off as coincidence and act like nothing's going on. But when this pattern keeps repeating, it usually points to something more intentional underneath. What looks accidental might actually be their way of staying connected without ever having to openly pursue it. They leave small traces instead of making bold moves, and for someone terrified of vulnerability, those small traces can carry a lot of weight. Fifth, they create distance right when things start getting real. This last sign is often the hardest to make sense of because it feels so backwards. Just as the connection starts deepening, right as real emotional intimacy starts to form, they suddenly pull away hard. A lot of people take this as proof the avoidant never really cared, but the truth is usually more layered than that. For someone avoidant, real emotional closeness can trigger the same fear response as actual rejection. The stronger their feelings grow, the more exposed they end up feeling, and that exposure can feel like a real threat. Once genuine closeness starts to take shape, their internal warning system kicks into gear. All at once, they're hit with the fear of losing control. They worry about becoming too dependent on someone. They're afraid of getting hurt, afraid of being left, afraid of rejection, and maybe most of all, afraid of being seen in a way they can't manage or control. That's when the self-protective habits kick in. They might pick fights over nothing. They might disappear emotionally without any explanation. They might turn inconsistent, confusing, or completely unreachable. Sometimes they'll suddenly start talking about needing space, right when things were actually going somewhere good. From the outside, this looks completely backwards. Why would someone pull away from a connection they clearly want? Because for an avoidant, wanting someone that badly can feel genuinely dangerous. The closer they get, the more exposed they feel, and exposure is exactly what they've spent years trying to avoid. Their gut reaction isn't always to lean into what they care about. Sometimes it's to run from it, not because the feelings aren't there, but because those feelings got too big to handle comfortably. That's why a sudden retreat doesn't automatically mean they stopped caring. Sometimes it actually means the opposite. The attachment grew stronger than their defenses could keep up with, and instead of facing those emotions head-on, they tried to distance themselves from whatever triggered them in the first place. So what do you do if you suspect an avoidant is secretly hung up on you? First, understand this isn't your job to fix. It's not your job to decode every little signal, chase every scrap of attention, or run yourself emotionally ragged trying to get them to open up. Their healing belongs to them. Their fears are theirs to work through. No amount of love from you can do that work on their behalf. The healthier move is to focus on what they actually do, rather than getting lost in endless guesswork about what they might be feeling. Because even if hidden emotions are real, a genuinely healthy relationship needs more than secret attachment. It needs consistency, it needs open communication, and most of all, it needs someone willing to actually show up emotionally when it counts. One of the most common mistakes is assuming that being on someone's mind constantly automatically means the relationship is healthy. It doesn't. Someone can think about you non-stop and still be completely unable to give you the emotional steadiness you actually need. You might take up a huge amount of space in their inner world and still feel lonely when you're actually together. That's because being fixated on someone and being emotionally available for them are two completely different things. The feelings can be real, the attachment can be genuine, but if fear is still running the show, the relationship stays trapped in a loop of confusion and uncertainty. A lot of avoidants who fall hard are fighting an internal war, desperately wanting closeness, while also dreading everything real intimacy demands. And unless they're actually working through those fears themselves, there's only so much your love, patience, or understanding can fix. You can't do someone else's emotional work for them, no matter how much you care. You deserve a relationship where affection isn't hidden behind walls. You deserve communication that doesn't leave you constantly guessing. You deserve reassurance that comes through actual words and actions, not something you have to piece together like a puzzle. That said, don't ignore your gut either. If you sense there's something real underneath the surface, there very well might be. Avoidants tend to become masters at hiding what they feel, sometimes from other people, sometimes even from themselves. But emotions have a way of leaking out eventually. They show up as unexpected jealousy, sudden frustration, moments of pulling away, and occasionally brief flashes of vulnerability that feel totally out of character. One day they're distant and unreachable, the next they're unusually warm and present. That back and forth can leave you emotionally drained, constantly trying to figure out what's actually going on. But here's what matters. You're not responsible for solving a puzzle someone else refuses to explain. You're not responsible for decoding every mixed signal they send. You're not responsible for carrying the full emotional weight of the connection by yourself. If someone clearly has strong feelings for you but keeps hiding behind fear and avoidance, the real question isn't whether they care, it's whether they're actually capable of showing up in a healthy way. Wanting someone isn't enough on its own. Being attached to someone isn't enough. Thinking about someone all the time isn't enough. Real relationships need action, honesty, and emotional accountability. Without those things, even the deepest feelings can create nothing but instability. In a strange way, obsession without emotional courage just becomes its own kind of chaos. It might feel flattering at first to know someone can't stop thinking about you. It might even boost your ego for a while, but staying stuck in that cycle usually drains way more than it gives back. Eventually, the uncertainty wears you down. Eventually, the waiting wears you down. Eventually, hoping someone will finally become emotionally available wears you down completely. If you see these patterns in someone and genuinely want a future with them, the healthiest thing you can do is simple. Be upfront about your needs, communicate clearly, and lay out your expectations calmly and directly. Give them a real chance to meet you halfway. Then watch what they actually do, because actions will always tell you more than hidden feelings ever could. And if they keep retreating into confusion, avoidance, and emotional games anyway, you already have your answer. Sometimes the strongest form of self-respect is choosing peace over uncertainty. Sometimes loving yourself means walking away from a connection that just never fully shows up. Love shouldn't feel like chasing someone who's always slightly out of reach. It shouldn't feel like constantly reading between the lines of silence. It shouldn't feel like surviving on occasional crumbs of affection. You deserve someone who stands in front of you with real clarity. Someone who doesn't just think about you privately or care about you in secret, but who has the courage to say what they feel and follow it up with consistent action. Someone who looks you in the eye and says, "I'm here, I'm choosing this, I'm choosing you." Anything less eventually fades into background noise, no matter how intense the hidden feelings behind it might be. Thank you for spending this time with Avoidant Decoded. If any of these patterns remind you of someone from your past, someone in your life right now, or maybe even yourself, remember that awareness is where real change starts. Understanding attachment patterns can help make sense of confusing experiences, but understanding on its own isn't enough. Healthy relationships are built on openness, trust, accountability, and effort from both sides. No matter how complicated someone's emotional world might be, you deserve honesty instead of uncertainty, and clarity instead of mixed signals. If this resonated with you, feel free to like, share, and subscribe to Avoidant Decoded for more on attachment styles, relationships, emotional healing, and personal growth. And let me know in the comments, have you ever dealt with someone who seemed deeply attached but never actually admitted it? What happened? Your story might help someone else going through something similar. Until next time, protect your peace, trust your worth, and never settle for a connection that leaves you unsure of where you stand. You deserve to be appreciated openly, valued consistently, and loved without confusion. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one. To wrap this up, the core point is simple. Hidden emotions aren't the same thing as healthy love. An avoidant might think about you constantly, watch you from afar, remember small details about your life, and carry real internal attachment they rarely show. They might even react strongly when they sense you pulling away, but none of that automatically builds something stable or healthy. We've looked at how avoidant behavior can seem contradictory, showing clear signs of investment, curiosity, jealousy, or repeated attempts to reconnect, while in the same breath creating distance, confusion, and inconsistency. That push-pull dynamic leaves people stuck, overanalyzing every text, every silence, every interaction, chasing clarity in the middle of mixed signals. The truth is, both things can exist at once. Someone can feel deeply and still be emotionally unavailable. They can want connection and fear it simultaneously. They can genuinely care and still pull away the moment things get real. But understanding this shouldn't become an excuse to tolerate inconsistency or emotional uncertainty, because real relationships aren't built on hidden feelings. They're built on communication, consistency, accountability, and mutual emotional presence. Without those things, feelings alone don't mean much in practice. This is usually where the confusion starts. People mistake intensity for commitment. They assume that if someone is clearly affected emotionally, it has to eventually turn into real effort. But obsession and commitment aren't the same thing. Obsession watches from a distance. Commitment steps forward. Obsession wonders and overthinks. Commitment communicates and acts. Obsession stays hidden. Commitment shows up again and again. That distinction changes everything. If you notice these patterns in someone, stay grounded in what's actually happening rather than what could theoretically happen. Pay more attention to consistent behavior than to bursts of intensity. Feelings that never turn into action can't build anything stable. At the same time, don't lose yourself trying to decode someone who either won't or can't be emotionally clear with you. Overanalyzing mixed signals just keeps you stuck. Your own emotional well-being matters just as much. Your need for clarity, safety, and consistency isn't something you should have to negotiate away. Healthy love doesn't leave you guessing. It doesn't require constant interpretation. It doesn't hide behind confusion. Healthy love is direct, steady, emotionally safe, and above all, mutual. So going forward, remember this. Real love isn't measured by how intensely someone feels in private, but by how consistently they show up in reality. If someone genuinely values you, their actions will make that obvious, without ambiguity. And if they can't meet you with clarity and consistency, no amount of hidden emotion can make up for what's missing. Choose peace over confusion. Choose self-respect over waiting around. And choose the kind of love that never needs to be questioned, decoded, or guessed at. The kind that's clearly shown, consistently given, and freely offered. That's the only kind of love worth holding on to. An avoidant can think about you endlessly, remember every small detail, and feel real attachment, yet still never show up the way you deserve. Hidden emotion is not the same as healthy love, and obsession is not the same as commitment. What matters isn't how deeply someone feels in silence, but how consistently they show up in action. So notice behavior, not potential, and never mistake intensity for effort. Choose clarity over confusion, and never settle for a love that must be guessed at instead of given freely.